October 25th, 1944, 10:53 a.m. Off Samar Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Yukio Seki banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, call sign Zeke, through heavy anti-aircraft fire, aiming for the flat deck of USS St. An American escort carrier struggling to evade the incoming formation. 5 Japanese aircraft dove toward the American task force that morning, part of history's first organized kamikaze operation. 4 were shot down or missed their targets completely. Seki did not miss. His Zero, carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, struck St. Louis flight deck at 10:53 a.m. The impact detonated bombs and aviation fuel stored on the hangar deck below. Secondary explosions ripped through the carrier. Within 30 minutes, USS St. A 10,900-ton warship crewed by 889 men, capsized and sank, taking 113 sailors to the bottom of Leyte Gulf. She became the first major Allied warship sunk by an organized kamikaze attack. She would not be the last. American naval commanders had dismissed Japanese suicide tactics as desperation, the final thrashing of a defeated enemy. Intelligence reports suggested Japan's conventional air forces were decimated. Their carrier fleet was destroyed. Their experienced pilots were dead. What remained were poorly trained teenagers flying obsolete aircraft. How much damage could desperate amateurs possibly inflict? The answer, written in burning steel and seawater across the final 10 months of the Pacific War, would horrify the U.S. Navy and change naval warfare forever. Approximately 2,800 kamikaze attackers would sink between 34 and 47 ships, damage more than 300 others, kill nearly 5,000 American sailors, and wound over 4,800 more. The dismissal ended on October 25, 1944. The dying had just begun.
On October 20, 1944, Admiral Takejiro Onishi announced the formation of a special attack unit, Tokotai, to support Japan's desperate defense of the Philippines. The concept was simple, brutal, and previously unthinkable. Pilots would deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into American warships. The term chosen was kamikaze, divine wind, referencing the legendary typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281, saving Japan from conquest. The mythology was intentional. Japan needed a miracle. Conventional air attacks had failed catastrophically. At the Battle of the Philippines Sea in June 1944, nearly 500 Japanese carrier and land-based aircraft were destroyed in a single afternoon. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's naval aviation was effectively annihilated. Experienced pilots, men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk British battleships, who had dominated the Pacific for 2 years, were dead. Replacements were teenagers with fewer than 100 flight hours, barely capable of taking off and landing, much less engaging in aerial combat against American pilots with 500-plus hours of training. Japan couldn't win through skill anymore, but perhaps it could win through will. The first kamikaze volunteers came from the 201st Naval Air Group based at Clark Field near Manila. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a graduate of the Japanese Naval Academy, newly married, was not an ideologue. When questioned by a reporter before launching the first organized kamikaze attack, he remarked that such tactics were heresy, but he volunteered anyway. So did 23 others. American intelligence officers received reports about Japanese suicide tactics in late October 1944 and dismissed them as exaggeration. Yes, individual Japanese pilots had crashed damaged aircraft into ships since 1942 when conventional attacks failed. Desperate pilots choosing death over capture was nothing new. But an organized campaign? units specifically trained for suicide missions, aircraft purpose-built for one-way attacks. The Americans couldn't believe Japan would deliberately waste pilots in such fashion. Pilots took years to train. Aircraft were expensive. Resources were scarce. Why would any military deliberately destroy both in suicide attacks? The assumption revealed a fundamental cultural misunderstanding. Americans viewed suicide as irrational, the act of desperate, defeated men. The Japanese command saw it differently. Organized sacrifice for a greater strategic purpose. One pilot, one plane, one bomb, guaranteed to reach the target because the pilot wouldn't evade, wouldn't abort, wouldn't miss. The mathematics were compelling. Despite radar detection, airborne interception, and massive anti-aircraft barrages, 14% of kamikaze attacks succeeded in hitting their targets. That success rate was dramatically higher than conventional bombing attacks, which rarely exceeded 3% hit rates against maneuvering warships. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle off Samar, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first organized kamikaze force struck. 7 escort carriers were hit: USS Kitkunbe, Fanshawe Bay, Sangamon, Santee, St. Lo, Swanee, and White Plains. USS St. Lo sank. The others survived, but were knocked out of action for weeks or months. The psychological impact was immediately catastrophic. American sailors had faced Japanese bombs, torpedoes, and strafing runs for 3 years. This was different. The enemy pilots weren't trying to drop bombs and escape. They were the bombs. The aircraft became guided missiles controlled by human brains, calculating angles, timing, and impact points with suicidal determination.
The first kamikaze force consisted of 24 volunteer pilots from Japan's 201st Navy Air Group. Within weeks, the program expanded dramatically. By November 1944, hundreds of aircraft were being converted for kamikaze missions. By December, thousands. All told, more than 1,321 Japanese aircraft conducted kamikaze attacks during the war. Some sources suggest numbers exceeding 2,800 individual kamikaze missions when including Army air units and later operations. The discrepancy exists because defining kamikaze became complicated. Some attacks were organized suicide missions by dedicated special attack units. Others were desperate crashes by conventional pilots who chose death over returning to base, having failed their mission. The Japanese employed virtually every aircraft type for kamikaze missions. The most common were Mitsubishi A6M-0s, Zeke, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Val, Mitsubishi G4M bombers, Betty, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, Kate. In the final months, every flyable aircraft was used. But the most terrifying weapon was purpose-built, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, cherry blossom to the Japanese, baka to the Americans. This was a rocket-powered flying bomb carried beneath the Mitsubishi G4M bomber and released near Allied ships. The Ohka pilot would glide toward the target, then ignite solid-fuel rockets that accelerated the aircraft to over 600 miles per hour in the final dive. At that speed, the Ohka was essentially unstoppable. The destroyer USS Manert L. Abel was obliterated by an Ohka strike on April 12, 1945. One conventional kamikaze had already damaged the ship when an Ohka, streaking toward the destroyer at over 600 miles per hour, struck the forward fire room and detonated. The destroyer broke in half and sank in minutes. American sailors developed a particular dread of the Ohka. Conventional kamikazes could sometimes be shot down. Their approach was visible, their speed was limited. The Ohka in its final rocket-powered dive was a supersonic missile guided by human intelligence. By the time you saw it, it had already hit you. The expansion of kamikaze operations forced the Navy to reevaluate everything: ship formations, combat air patrols, radar picket positioning, anti-aircraft tactics.
Nothing the Navy had learned in 3 years of Pacific combat applied to an enemy that didn't care about survival. Traditional aerial combat assumed both sides wanted to live. Defensive tactics exploited that assumption. Make attacking too dangerous, and enemy pilots would abort. Kamikaze pilots never aborted. Making the approach dangerous was irrelevant. They were already dead. The only question was whether they'd take Americans with them.
The invasion of Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, beginning April 1, 1945, would become the bloodiest naval campaign in American history. Not because of Japanese naval forces, which barely existed anymore, but because of kamikazes. Japanese strategists realized a prolonged land battle on Okinawa would pin down thousands of U.S. and Allied ships near the island for months. The plan was to employ 10,000 Japanese aircraft, half of which would be kamikazes. The ships, constrained geographically and unable to maneuver freely, would be sitting ducks. The most dangerous positions were radar picket stations, destroyers positioned 50 to 70 miles offshore to provide early warning of incoming air raids. Of 149 Allied ships hit or sunk by kamikazes during the Battle of Okinawa, 88 were destroyers and destroyer types, and another 30 were destroyer escorts. These ships were alone, exposed, the first to see incoming raids, and the primary targets once kamikazes broke through. The kamikaze pilots knew the radar pickets had to be there. They provided the defensive umbrella for the entire invasion fleet. Destroy the radar pickets, blind the fleet, then attack the transports and carriers. The Japanese launched 10 major kamikaze operations called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, attacks between April and June 1945. Each Kikusui involved hundreds of aircraft, both conventional and suicide attackers, saturating American defenses through sheer numbers. Kikusui No. 1, April 6th to 7th, 1945. More than 350 kamikazes attacked American ships. They sank 11 vessels and damaged 17 others, killing over 360 sailors. The minesweeper USS Defense went down. LST-447 sank. Support ships Logan Victory and Hobbs Victory were destroyed. The Japanese lost over 350 aircraft, planes and pilots they could not replace. Kikusui No. 2, April 11th to 12th, 1945. More than 300 kamikazes attacked over 2 days. Only one destroyer was sunk, but 19 vessels were damaged. Among those hit was USS St, struck by a kamikaze whose bomb exploded 40 feet above the ship, showering the decks with shrapnel. 1 sailor died, 59 were wounded. St would be hit again. On July 29, 1945, 2 weeks before Japan surrendered, St was struck by her second kamikaze. She survived both attacks. Some ships weren't as fortunate or as resilient.
On the morning of May 11, 1945, the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill was operating about 70 miles off Okinawa. Low clouds covered southern Japan, with likelihood of rain. At 06, 6 Mitsubishi Zeros from the 306th Showa Special Attack Squadron took off, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb. Squadron leader Lieutenant Shizo Yasunori was determined to find American carriers. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, a 23-year-old Waseda University graduate drafted the previous summer, had graduated from flying school just 3 months earlier with fewer than 150 total flying hours. Bunker Hill was the flagship for Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force that had been operating continuously for 58 days, supporting the Okinawa invasion. Her flight deck was packed with aircraft preparing for morning operations.
Radar operators strained to detect incoming threats through storm interference. Yasunori's formation broke into clear skies to find American carriers white against the blue sea. Anti-aircraft explosions surrounded them immediately. One plane fell away burning. Ogawa closed on his leader and followed him into his dive. At approximately 10 a.m., Lieutenant Yasunori struck first. His Zero, strafing the flight deck as it approached, dropped its 550-pound bomb that penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the gallery deck below, igniting massive fires. Yasunori's aircraft crashed into the deck aft of the island structure. 30 seconds later, Ensign Ogawa followed. His last radio transmission: "Now I am nosediving into the ship." Ogawa's Zero, also on fire, dropped its bomb forward of the island before crashing into the island structure itself. The bomb exploded in Air Group 84's ready rooms, killing dozens of pilots and aircrew instantly. Fire spread everywhere. Aircraft on the flight deck, fully fueled and armed, exploded. Burning aviation fuel poured through openings into the hangar deck. Ammunition cooked off. The carrier was an inferno. Captain Gene A. Seitz ordered a hard turn to port, attempting to clear burning fuel and debris from the deck. Firefighting crews, many already burned or wounded, fought to control blazes spreading through multiple decks. The cruiser, USS Wilkes-Barre, pulled alongside and turned her fire hoses onto the burning carrier. 13 of Admiral Mitcher's staff died in the fires. The admiral was forced to transfer by breeches buoy, a rope and pulley system, to the destroyer USS English, then to the carrier USS Enterprise, which became the new flagship. For hours, Bunker Hill burned. The crew fought through smoke, flame, and exploding ordnance to save their ship. Men jumped overboard to escape the heat, choosing the ocean over immolation. Rescue vessels plucked survivors from the water. Bodies were everywhere, on the flight deck, in passageways, trapped in compartments below. By evening, the fires were under control. Bunker Hill, though devastated, remained afloat. The casualties were staggering: 396 men killed or missing, 264 wounded, the second highest personnel losses suffered by any carrier to survive the war, exceeded only by USS Franklin. Among the dead were 43 men whose remains were never found, incinerated in the initial explosions or trapped in compartments that became ovens. The following day, survivors conducted burial at sea for those whose bodies had been recovered. Years later, former Bunker Hill Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Bruce Myers was reading a book about the carrier. Upon seeing a photograph of dead shipmates, the memories came flooding back. He walked out of his office and cried like a baby for an hour. I had stood in that same spot and saw those bodies. Bunker Hill limped to Pearl Harbor, then to Bremerton Naval Shipyard for repairs. She was still in the shipyard when Japan surrendered in August 1945. Though repaired, she never returned to combat operations. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots, 2 bombs. In 90 seconds, they had effectively destroyed a 27,000-ton aircraft carrier and killed nearly 400 Americans. And Bunker Hill was one ship, on one day, in one attack.
American defenses evolved constantly throughout 1945, but kamikaze tactics evolved faster. Combat Air Patrol, CAP, F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair fighters maintained continuous patrols above the fleet, attempting to intercept incoming raids before they reached the ships. At the Battle of Okinawa, one CAP engagement saw 8 Corsairs spot and surprise 30 kamikazes, shooting down 11. But 19 got through, and those 19 would hit ships. Radar picket destroyers. Positioned 20 miles out from the main fleet, these destroyers provided early warning of incoming raids.
Unfortunately, this made them extremely exposed, often subjected to attacks by multiple kamikazes. Being the early warning system meant being the first target. Anti-aircraft fire. American ships bristled with 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Ehrlichen cannons specifically positioned for close-range anti-aircraft defense. In theory, this created an impenetrable wall of steel. In practice, a determined kamikaze diving at 300+ miles per hour had perhaps 15 seconds of exposure to defensive fire. If the first burst didn't destroy him completely, he would hit you. Proximity fuses. American VT variable time proximity fuse shells exploded automatically when passing near an aircraft, creating shrapnel clouds that could destroy targets without direct hits. This technology significantly increased anti-aircraft effectiveness. But kamikazes were small, fast, and attacking from unpredictable angles. Often they were too close before radar could lock on and guns could track effectively. The problem was mathematical. Approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died during the war. Despite massive American defenses, 14% succeeded in hitting ships. That meant roughly 1 in 7 kamikazes got through. When Japan launched 300 kamikazes in a single Kikusui operation, 40 to 50 would hit American vessels. And nearly 8.5% of all ships hit by kamikazes sank. Not damaged, not crippled, sank completely. Between 34 and 47 ships, sources vary, were sunk by kamikazes, including destroyers, escort carriers, landing ships, and support vessels. Another 300+ were damaged, many so severely they never returned to combat. USS Callahan, a Fletcher-class destroyer, became the last U.S. Navy ship sunk by a kamikaze on July 28, 1945, just 17 days before Japan surrendered. The kamikaze that hit Callahan was a Yokosuka K-5Y Willow, primarily a training biplane, showing the depth of Japanese desperation. A training aircraft, a wooden biplane, and it sank a modern destroyer because the pilot was willing to die to reach his target.
The Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia was struck so many times by kamikazes that she earned the nickname the Kamikaze Magnet. Australia was first hit on October 21, 1944, 4 days before the organized kamikaze campaign officially began. The attack killed 30 officers and sailors and wounded 62 more. She was hit repeatedly throughout the Philippines campaign, but refused to sink. USS Laffey, stationed at a radar picket post off Okinawa, suffered one of the worst attacks in naval history. She was struck by multiple kamikazes during a sustained assault, but survived through extraordinary damage control and sheer determination. Today, Laffey is preserved at Patriots Point in Charleston, South Carolina, her battle scars still visible. USS Intrepid was struck by 5 separate kamikaze attacks during the war. Each time, damage control teams saved the ship. Each time, she returned to action. Her crew nicknamed her the Fighting Eye and the Evil Eye. The latter because they believed she was cursed to be targeted repeatedly. The resilience of American damage control saved dozens of ships that should have sunk. British carriers with their armored flight decks fared even better. Kamikaze impacts that would have crippled American carriers were often repaired quickly on British vessels. In the immediate aftermath of kamikaze strikes, British fleet carriers with armored flight decks recovered more quickly than U.S. carriers. However, post-war analysis showed that some British carriers, like HMS Formidable, suffered structural damage that led to them being scrapped as beyond economic repair. But survival came at terrible cost. More than 7,000 Allied naval personnel, American, Australian, and British, died from kamikaze attacks. At Okinawa alone, American casualties from approximately 1,500 kamikaze attacks totaled 3,048 dead or missing and 6,035 wounded. The kamikazes inflicted horrific damage. They terrorized American sailors. They sank dozens of ships and killed thousands. But they failed strategically. Japan's goal was to make American casualties so unbearable that the United States would negotiate a conditional peace rather than invade the Japanese home islands. The Kamikaze campaign was designed to demonstrate that conquering Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, a price too high to pay. The strategy had fatal flaws. Resources were insufficient. At the time of surrender, Japan had more than 9,000 planes in the home islands available for kamikaze attacks, and more than 5,000 had already been specially fitted for suicide missions to resist the planned invasion. But by then, fuel was critically scarce, pilots barely trained, and aircraft maintenance nearly impossible. The thousands of planes existed largely on paper. American industrial capacity was overwhelming. The Japanese claimed to have sunk 81 ships and damaged 195. Post-war records show they actually sunk 34 ships and damaged 288. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching one escort carrier per week, one destroyer every few days. Japan couldn't sink ships faster than America could build them. The atomic bomb changed everything. Japan's strategy assumed a conventional invasion requiring months of amphibious operations, vulnerable to kamikaze attack. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, rendered the entire kamikaze reserve meaningless. The war ended before those thousands of kamikaze aircraft could be employed. Between August 9 and September 2, 1945, several kamikaze airstrikes were recorded against Soviet forces during the brief Soviet-Japanese War, including attacks on Soviet naval vessels at Vladivostok. These final desperate strikes accomplished nothing. Admiral Chester Nimitz, after Okinawa, reportedly told General Simon Buckner to accelerate the ground campaign because kamikaze losses were becoming unsustainable. Nimitz was genuinely concerned that continuing kamikaze attacks might force withdrawal of the fleet from Okinawa. The strategy was working tactically, but strategically, Japan had already lost.
The psychological impact of kamikazes extended far beyond the war. Survivors carried trauma for decades. Bruce Myers of USS Bunker Hill attempted to forget the nightmares he witnessed. Decades later, seeing a photograph triggered complete emotional collapse. Thousands of Pacific War veterans suffered similar PTSD, though that diagnosis wouldn't exist formally for another 30 years. American naval doctrine changed permanently. Post-war carrier designs emphasized damage control, fire suppression systems, and armored flight decks, all lessons learned from kamikaze attacks. Guided missiles, ironically, were the direct descendants of kamikaze tactics, explosive warheads controlled by human intelligence, replaced by electronic guidance systems. The strategic implications were debated for decades. Some historians argue that kamikazes nearly forced an American withdrawal from Okinawa, potentially changing the war's timeline. Others contend the attacks merely delayed the inevitable at horrific human cost. Captain Motoharu Okamura, who commanded a kamikaze squadron, remarked in 1944, "I firmly believe that the only way to swing the war in our favor is to resort to crash dive attacks with our planes. There is no other way. Provide me with 300 planes and I will turn the tide of war." He was given thousands of planes. The tide didn't turn. Japan lost anyway. But the cost was written in American blood and Japanese desperation. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who organized the first kamikaze units, committed ritual suicide following Japan's surrender. He apologized to the estimated 4,000 pilots he had sent to their deaths and to their families. The dismissal was complete by October 26, 1944, 24 hours after the first organized kamikaze attacks. American commanders who had mocked Japanese desperation now faced a weapon they couldn't fully counter. Ships that should have been invulnerable were sinking. Sailors who should have been safe behind layers of defensive systems were dying in flames. The Kamikaze campaign was desperation warfare at its most extreme. It was also tactically effective beyond what conventional air power could achieve. One pilot, one plane, one bomb. Guaranteed delivery to target. No evasion, no abort, no miss due to poor aim or mechanical failure. The pilot was the guidance system, and he wouldn't stop until impact or death. American sailors learned to scan the skies with existential dread. Every distant aircraft could be a kamikaze. Every radar contact could be the formation that would kill them. The war had reduced itself to mathematics. How many kamikazes would attack today? How many would your ship's guns destroy? Would one get through? The answer, far too often, was yes. Today, USS Bunker Hill's Belle resides on the guided missile cruiser that bears her name, CG-52, commissioned in 1986. The original carrier was scrapped in 1973, but her legacy remains. Bunker Hill received the Presidential Unit Citation and 11 battle stars for service from November 1943 to May 1945. She earned every one in blood. Survivors of kamikaze attacks rarely spoke about their experiences. The trauma was too deep, the memories too vivid. When they did speak, common themes emerged. The helplessness of watching aircraft dive toward your ship while your guns couldn't stop them. The sound of impact, metal tearing, explosions, screams. The fire that followed, the friends who died. And the knowledge that the pilot intended to die, wanted to die, had volunteered to die specifically to take you with him. That psychological dimension, fighting an enemy who sought death rather than avoided it, was something American sailors were unprepared for and struggled to process. How do you intimidate someone who doesn't fear death? How do you deter someone whose mission is explicitly suicidal? You can't. You can only shoot them down before they reach you, and 14% of the time, that didn't work. The Americans dismissed Japanese suicide bombers until kamikazes sent U.S. ships to the bottom. Then they stopped dismissing and started dying. At least 47 ships sank. More than 300 were damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors died. Another 4,800 were wounded. And those numbers represent only the physical casualties, the psychological casualties, survivors haunted by nightmares, men who spent decades unable to speak about what they witnessed, numbered in the tens of thousands. The kamikaze campaign was Japan's final gambit. It failed strategically, but tactically, for 10 months from October 1944 to August 1945, it was the most effective anti-shipping weapon of the Pacific War. One aircraft, one pilot, one bomb. 14% hit rate, and nearly 1 in 10 ships hit went to the bottom. The divine wind blew across the Pacific. It scattered American ships, shattered American confidence, and killed thousands of American sailors. It didn't change the war's outcome. Nothing could have by late 1944. But it proved that desperation can be weaponized, that human will can be more dangerous than technology, and that dismissing your enemy's capabilities is an invitation to catastrophe. American commanders learned that lesson in burning steel off Okinawa. They never forgot it.